Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Juan de Pablo. I am the Executive Vice President for Science, Innovation, National Laboratory, and Global Initiatives at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much for joining us today on this event entitled Democracy and Economic Development. Everyone, being here. From its very beginning, the University of Chicago has dedicated itself to the preservation and celebration of the freedom of expression as an essential element of the university's culture today. The commitment principles of free speech and academic freedom and the importance to rigorous and open-color inquiry are the pillars sustaining the mission of our institute. In true Chicago fashion, the university approaches the topic of democracy and governance from multiple perspectives. The university leads a range of initiatives from academic research and student education and training global leaders and political leaders. These efforts draw on of data science, the university history, the arts, medicine, even mathematics. University scholars and instructors question context, underlying trends, training internal influences, individual actors. They take care to listen to our voices and experiences and consider them thoughtfully and critically. Continuing this tradition, today's program will consist of a discussion between underlying of Latin countries who will share their personal observations of democracy and economic development in Latin America. We are very grateful to Her Excellency Leonel, His Excellency Leonel, His Excellency Lagos, His Excellency Fernández, for joining us for this event. I would also like our moderator, Alex Fernández, from the University of Chicago. I think that we can all agree that the intersection of democracy and economics is a particularly important topic given the world events. And I look forward to this discussion. I would also like to thank these politics, Chicago and the Global Foundation Democracy Development for coordinating this conversation and bringing Thank you so much. And now a few housekeeping notes. I look forward to after the conversation concludes, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone and remember, everyone is welcome at the microphone. Please keep your questions on point. As usual, students will be given priority towards the first three questions. Additionally, we will solicit questions from others that are joining virtually. If a question from a remote has been selected by IOP staff, students volunteer will ask it on the person's behalf. Now, to formally introduce our speakers, is Jacqueline Rosa, the fourth-year political science major with history. She's engaged with the IOP Leaders of Color and the Fellows Program, and a member of the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board. Outside of the IOP, Jackie was Senate campaigning from the state of Wisconsin, the place where I used to live, and has interned for the U.S. State Department. Welcome, Jackie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Institute of Politics first series event, Democracy and Economic Development in Latin America. My name is Jacqueline Rosa. I'm a fourth-year college studying political science, history, and human rights. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm honored to introduce you to our accomplished panel moderator today. We'll engage in conversation about democracy and economic development in America and societal impacts. Today we have brought together four former Latin American presidents. Laura Chinchilla was the 46th president of Costa Rica, serving from 2010 to 2014, and she was the first female to be elected president of the nation. Following her time in office, President Chinchilla participated in Project IDB, United Nations Development Program, and United States Agency for International Development. These projects focus on sustainable development, institutional reform, rule of law, and strengthening citizen security. Joining President Chinchilla is Leonel Fernández, who served as the 50th and 52nd President of the Dominican Republic from 1996 to 2000 and from 2004 to 2012. President Fernández is currently President of the World Fund for Democracy and Development and President of the Public Executive of the United Caribbean. He is also the former President of the European Union, Latin America Foundation, and in 2018 he was unanimously elected President of the World Federation of the United Nations Institutions. Our next panelist is Ricardo Lago, who served as the 32nd President of Chile from 2006. After leaving office, President Lago founded and is president of the Foundation for Democracy and Development and was a commissioner on the social determinants of health to the World Health Organization from 2005 to 2008. From 2010 to 2010, he was the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change, and he was appointed Commissioner for the Global Commission on Policy in 2011. Last but certainly not least, our final panelist is Ernesto Cedillo. He served as the 66th President of Mexico from 1994 to 2000. Today, President Cedillo serves on the Global Commission on Policy, the Kofi Annan Commission. President Cedillo currently teaches at Yale University, and he is the Frederick Eisner 1974 Director of the Yale Center for Globalization. Our moderator for today is anchor reporter for Univision Chicago, Alex Fernández. He is also served as guest host for Latino Voices on WTTW. It is a pleasure to have you all join us in Chicago. Let's give a warm welcome to our guests. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Officially, relax a little bit, and talk to our fine guests this evening. Met all of you today. Welcome once again. It's a pleasure to have you in our
in the year 2000, well, was the beginning of the Asian crisis. You know, always there is some crisis. That was the Asian crisis. And then for the Asian crisis, the copper price went down. And needless to say to you that in Chile, copper is so important. Almost 40% depends on copper. And what can I do? Because copper prices were here. So I decided to have a new rule. A rule about that we are going to have a surplus on the long-term price of copper, not on the real one. And this I call the structural superávit. And the structural superávit allowed me to expand, assuming that the copper price was much bigger than the real one. But then, when the real one was very high, very high, very high, I have to stay to the lower price. That was the one thing. Because I did that, it was possible then to keep the economy growing. And at the same time, important, at the same time, how are we going to distribute that growth? And here, from that point of view, Chile was not really an example, because this famous Gini coefficient was very poor. And therefore, the question is, what are we going to do with the Gini? And then the question was, unless we are going to work. Why? Because those people living under the poverty line were huge. And the only problem that to work with them was not a question of sending a check, was a question of how are we going to work with them in order that they defeated poverty. And this is what we did. And we were able to reduce poverty because not only the increases in per capita income can allow to do that. You need specific policies, and we did. And that's why I say, then the question was how to deliver. And how to deliver means that you have to have the economy in order. And to have a balanced budget, fiscal budget, is not a question of the right-wing parties or the left-wing party. It's the common sense. That's it. And sometimes we forgot that. And we think that it's not necessary to worry about. No, that's wrong. If you want to deliver, you need to have fiscal balanced budget, period. And these two things are so essential. But in the meantime, we discover that we are leaving behind the Industrial Revolution and the epochal change that means the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And therefore now we are going to the digital revolution. My goodness, that's a very difficult question. What are going to be the political institutions that will be allowed because of the digital revolution? In the industrial age, you have to wait for the next election, 4 years from now. Now, in the digital age, the prince, whatever is the prince, can listen what the people is telling. And you, the younger people here in this room, will know that new political institutions will emerge because in the future, the president, the prime minister, will have to have elements to learn how to listen, not to wait for the next election. And therefore, I would say that to run a country is to learn now to listen what the people is thinking about. Because politics used to be vertical in the Industrial Revolution time. The president was the leader. The leader of the party is in charge of the parliament and to have everything in the good place. Not anymore. Now, politics is horizontal. If this is going to be transmitted as going to be down in Chile, I don't want to read what they are telling me in the digital elements. And whatever they say, how long will this Lagos keep talking about? It's very difficult then. But that's going to be the world where you are going to be living. And therefore, new political institutions will emerge so that you will have to know how to listen. And because you are going to be able to listen, then you are going to be a little bit in advance of what are going to be the new demands, what is going to be the new goods and services that you have to deliver if you want to prevent that democracy is not working at all. Therefore, I follow very much what has been said by my previous speaker here, Laura. And Laura was very clear to say, well, what about politics and what about economics? Until what end those two things go together? And therefore, in today's world, you have to add then, finally, what about the COVID and what about Ukraine?
And we will
because those two things, are going to be one and the other, new elements that you have to implement. And from the point of view of Latin America, final word, Latin America to exist will require the big players. And the big players are Mexico, are Brazil, probably Colombia now, more than Argentina. The problem is that if those players are unable to talk to each other, we don't exist. And I'm very sorry to say this. At the beginning of the 21st century, Latin America existed because the presidents talked to each other on the phone. Now, not even the phone is being used. What about the digital age? My goodness.
Soon.
And it seems to me, and I hope, that Latin America to exist has to be able to speak with one voice. And that voice has nothing to do with political ideologies. That voice has to do with what are the major interests of Latin America. Unless we speak with one voice, nobody is going to speak and give a damn for Latin America. A president in this country says once, nobody gives a damn for Latin America. Well,
do you believe
it was possible to say no to the American president in one time, and we did because we thought that was important. That since we have some small countries, we need rules. And rules are established by the international community. And that is the advice that we need now. How are we going to be able to restore the credibility of Latin America, being the presidents being able to talk to each other?
Let's talk to each other. That's what we're here for. Okay. President Lagos, definitely.
Thank you.
Your colleagues as well. They want to share their opinion as well. So let's move on. President Fernández, on the topic that we began the discussion, talking about the war in Ukraine and how it's disrupting the economy. We're talking about Latin America. What do you think would be the lasting effects?
Well, I think in principle, the Russian invasion to Ukraine seems something very remote in Latin America. It seems that it doesn't have anything to do with us. It's very far away. But that is a wrong view, because the world has become more interconnected, more interdependent, and anything that happens in any place of the world has an impact in Latin America and in our country specifically. For example, from an economic standpoint, the situation has created some difficulties in the Dominican Republic. We depend very much on tourism, and because of this situation, Russian tourists and Ukrainian tourists that travel to the Dominican Republic are not doing it anymore. So it has a very immediate economic impact in our country. We have an Ukrainian community in the Dominican Republic. And when the invasion began, the Ukrainians were protesting in the Dominican streets. So you can see that even we are geographically very far away, it does have an impact in our daily lives, even in the Dominican Republic. And it makes sense of what a very famous Canadian sociologist once stated, that the world was becoming a global village. This is what we're seeing. The world is becoming a global village. Nothing is so remote that will not have an impact in your daily life. Of course, in the economy, gas prices are going up. And if gas prices are going up, oil prices are going up too. Fertilizers that are being manufactured in Ukraine also have an impact in the agricultural production. So prices are going up, and because of that, there is social unrest, not only in the Dominican but in all Latin Republic, but in all Latin America in general, because inflation has become the main challenge that we have in our economies here in the US and in Latin America in general.
Right.
Now, looking from a geopolitical perspective about the invasion of Russia to Ukraine and what this means for world peace. When Vladimir Putin came to power, he said that the dissolution of the Soviet Union had become the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century. This was his statement. He thinks that the dissolution is a geopolitical catastrophe for his country. And looking from a Russian interest perspective, of course, the incorporation of the previous socialist states in Eastern Europe into NATO represents a challenge. The Baltic states being part of NATO represents a challenge. The expansion of NATO into the eastern part, getting closer to Russia, might represent to them a challenge to their internal security. We can understand that argument. But there needs to be political and diplomatic solutions when you have those difficulties, when you have those interests in conflict. We had that once in Latin America back in the 60s. We had Russian missiles installed in Cuba. We had US missiles installed in Turkey. But there was a diplomatic solution to that. There was no war. Nobody intervened in the affairs of the other. So there is a Latin American lesson to these types of conflicts, that there can be, by the use of diplomatic tools, the ability to overcome any situation that can derive in violence. So this is a Latin American solution to that. Now, looking more into long term, I think there is already a rivalry between the Western world and the interest of creating a new international order by Russia and China, and creating what they call an Euro-Asian unit, which will challenge democratic values in the Western world. I think this is what it's all about in the long term. And of course, we in Latin America, we believe in the principles of democracy, of freedom, in the principles of free exchange among our nations. And of course, we have to look very closely at what is taking place in Russia and Ukraine. But from a humane perspective, which I think is the most important, what is taking place is unacceptable. And I think we should all come united in requesting from Russia a ceasefire and getting back to the table to find a diplomatic and political solution to this situation that I think it's outrageous for humankind at this point of history.
And I think everybody can agree on that regard, Mr. President. President Cedillo, you're an economist.
Nobody's perfect.
You know exactly.
Nobody's perfect.
Well, I had to say it. You know, everything is a domino effect, right? So what is your take on the impact that this war is having in Latin America?
Alex, let me go to your original question by clarifying that I cannot speak for Latin America by any means. However, I do have a position on this. Right after this incredibly criminal war started, I circulated a memo to my fellow elders, members of the group of elders, to which Ricardo and I part was founded by Nelson Mandela, and Kofi Annan was our chair for a number of years. And I said the elders should lead a campaign to have Vladimir Putin investigated and prosecuted for the crime of aggression. It's not only that the Russian state is violating the covenants of the ICC. The ICC can investigate the Russian state for crimes that the Russian state is committing, but Putin personally, as an individual, is committing the crime of aggression. So I do hope that one day Vladimir Putin is seated in something like the Nuremberg Tribunal and is made accountable for this crime. Now, second point, I am still disappointed about the way in which the international community and what we call the Western countries have reacted to this aggression. It was clear from day one that if Putin wanted to do a war with weapons, and brutality as he's doing, the West, given the nuclear scenario, had at least in a first phase the weapons of the economy to fight what Putin is doing. And in my view, the exercise of these sanctions to a significant extent is still an exercise of hypocrisy. Because it's true, Russia's reserves have been frozen, one half of it. Some limitations for the operation of their financial institutions have been imposed, but still the West is providing the flow of foreign exchange to Russia to have that economy being viable, at least for a while. And you can see it in the figures, what has happened with the ruble exchange rate after the initial shock. So I am very disappointed. You know, I get tired of reading the news that they are grabbing a nice boat or a nice Grumman, whatever, plane owned by Mr. Abramovich or Mr. Deripaska. What I want to see is the cash flow. And I think the cash flow for Putin to sustain this war is still there. So my question is the West going to fight this war to the last life in Ukraine? Or are they going to be totally serious? Take the pain because it's going to be an economic pain and make the Russian economy to come on its knees. And therefore, either the Russian people reconsider Putin or Putin reconsiders what he's doing. So that's my personal opinion. Now, in Latin America, I don't really know. I don't really know because it's a very ambiguous position. What I know, for example, is that the leaders or presidents of two of the largest countries in Latin America saw Mr. Putin a few days before the war started, when Mr. Putin was already threatening Ukraine with committing
Even
an
yesterday.
atrocity. And then another big country in Latin America has had a rather ambiguous and dubitative position, failing to condemn to the full extent what has happened. So I don't really know what's going on in Latin America. I think a lot of Latin Americans are as outraged as I am, not only because of the suffering that is being imposed, but because we know that every time international law is violated, we should also think about our own interests. Because today is Ukraine, tomorrow we don't know what country will be suffering that aggression. And of course, there is going to be economic suffering. This week is the IMF World Bank meeting, so I don't need to repeat the projections and the numbers for this year and next year, and we are going to have to take some pain, even in the best scenario. And of course, we don't want to think about the worst scenario. This is what happens if Mr. Putin decides, in its desperation, that he needs to show off one of his tactical nuclear weapons. I think that will be probably the beginning of the end.
It's definitely sad what's happening in Ukraine. We're talking about the United Nations just said that close to 5 million people have tried to escape Ukraine. The U.S. Biden administration said it would welcome 100,000 Ukrainians into the U.S. We know thousands are going to be left out. Just in March, over 3,000 people, Ukrainians, were in the U.S.-Mexico border. My question is Latin America, any country in Latin America, in a position to welcome Ukrainian refugees? And I'm going to start with Mr. President Cedillo.
Well, I don't know. I cannot speak for...
Well, you're talking about what you were just saying what the West could do to help. Is this a way to help?
Well, Mexico, for example, sometimes willingly and other times, fortunately, under arbitrary, abusive pressure from the part of the United States, specifically the Trump government, has taken literally those thousands of people from Central America. And we have other examples, the drama of Venezuela. How many Venezuelans have been taken in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, in some countries in Central America? You have to help others. And I think every country has the capacity to provide this humanitarian support. And that is important. But my point is that if there is not a chalk and no strategy to show Russia that this is not really for free, and that they will be themselves destroying their own economy, then this war is not going to stop. Or we are going to wait until the last Ukrainian has offered his or her life in this unjust situation. And I said, that's unacceptable. We are seeing a dramatic humanitarian crisis, and this must be stopped. Unfortunately, it's not the only humanitarian crisis we have seen in the world. And unfortunately, Mr. Putin will allege that he's doing what others did before, not too long ago.
He said it.
And it's true, by the way.
President Chinchilla, you wanted to speak?
Yes, I would like to start saying that in that sense, when we talk about migration, our region is a good example of good policies to receive the migrants in general terms. In fact, you have, for example, the case of Costa Rica. We are the second country in terms of the numbers of migrants coming from all around the region in our country. The case of Dominican Republic with the Asians, for example, in the case of Costa Rica with Nicaraguans, and many other places. Now you have Colombia. Colombia has received 3 million people in 5 years, 5 to 6 years. And so I will say, and we are talking about middle-income countries with not enough resources. Let me give you this figure. The international community spends more than 10 times on each refugee from Syria compared with each Venezuelan migrant. So the question here is for the developed world, I will say, because my concern is that now with the Ukrainian crisis, we are going to get even more irrelevant here in Latin America. Yeah. Yesterday, Secretary Blinken was in Panama talking about migration, because now they are rushing to see what they are going to offer for the Summit of the Americas. Because let me tell you, there are many frustrations about what is happening with the Biden administration, although they have a different approach, they have a different speech as compared with Trump, but they are not effective enough. And so they are rushing to present something, but my guess is that that is only going to be a declaration, a final comment. Only in March this year, the United States authorities apprehended more than 221,000 migrants in the frontier with Mexico. This should sound all the alarms about, of course, Ukraine is important. Of course, it is a global priority right now. Our countries are already receiving Ukrainians. Even Costa Rica offer a quota. But we need also to call the attention of the international community about what is happening in our own region.
Thank you very much. President Lagos.
The big problem, I think, is that in this crisis with regard to what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, well, where are we going to discuss that? Because you see, in our first crisis, September 11, 2001, it was very clear. All of us went to the Security Council. There was a place to discuss, and that was the place. And we discussed there. Number two crisis, 2008. Well, for 2008, it was President Bush. Yes, the same President Bush decided that the crisis is so huge that the G7 was not enough. And he made a decision to call a presidential dialogue between the G20. And the G20 emerged as the place where to discuss that international crisis. The third international crisis was the COVID. And the COVID, well, obviously, let's go to the World Health Organization. No. Mr. Trump said, no, doesn't exist. 1, 2, 3, 4. And therefore, there's no place where to discuss the COVID. Now, with President Biden, things might change. But finally, we have this one, the crisis that has been described so well by our Mexican president. And where are we going to discuss that? And we are going backwards so fast. I remember at the end of the Second World War, in our Latin American countries, all of us received people that has to leave Europe because of Nazism. And we received them. I remember a fellow in my high school coming from Italy. And for us it was normal to receive that. And the question is, how are we going to do that with regard to Ukraine? Are we Latin American countries being able to say, yes, I will accept so many? So here again, we have no place where to discuss. And we know the effects of the Ukrainian crisis. And we know the effect that is going to have from the political, from the economic, and for the moral standing of the Latin America. And we don't exist. So it's a tremendous challenge that the new generation will have. How are we going to be able to rebuild political institutions in the global world unless there is also how to rule that global world that is emerging in front of our eyes? And the answer of the Second World War was to have United Nations and all the institutions that came with that. Apparently, those institutions are not working well or are non-existent. And therefore, what should be our answer as Latin America? But in order to have an answer, at least we need presidents that can talk to each other. And as far as I know, they are not talking to each other. And therefore, that's a tremendous failure that we have now from the point of view of the international community. And let me tell you, it's emerging a new world in front of our eyes. And unless we speak with one voice, nobody will listen. Because we are only 8.5% of the total world population. And therefore, unless that people has one voice, otherwise we don't exist. It's very sorry, the state of affairs, but this is where we are. And here, in this house, we have to be very honest of where is actually our situation.
Time is flying. Thank you, President Lagos. Time is flying, so I want to get through these questions as fast as I can. I don't want to leave you out, President Fernández, on this same question, but we need to move on to other topics as well.
Well, President Lagos is asking where to discuss these issues. Well, last night we were at the ballpark. We were watching the game between the Cubs and the Pirates.
Nice.
And we saw players from Venezuela, from the Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, and from Cuba. And for a moment I thought, is this the United Nations? I'm not suggesting Wrigley Field is the place to discuss welfare, but we had a very wide Latin American representation last night, of which we're very proud. I agree totally with what President Lagos and my colleagues have said here today. We cannot have a personal opinion about if our countries can be receptive to Ukrainian refugees. You have to remember that we are all unemployed at this moment. We are former presidents.
I do have a job.
You do have a job. Okay.
Wait a minute.
Well, I only have honorific participation. Anyhow, what I do agree basically is the global irrelevance of Latin America at this moment. because we have always spoken about regional integration.
Yeah.
And this integration has to be political, it must have political dialogue. It is about trade, it is about economics, it is about finance, it is about moving people across the board. We don't have that at this moment because Latin America has become too polarized.
Is it possible? Is it possible with what's going on in Venezuela, what's happening in Mexico? Is it possible to have that?
I do think it's possible. I think you just have to create the appropriate environment to make that happen. We have to strengthen our regional institutions, and I think that's the way to move forward. We have CELAC, no? as our main institutional regional integration mechanism is not operating because of the differences we have between Brazil and Mexico with some other countries in the region, with Argentina, for example, and Venezuela and the others, right? We have that. But eventually, out of necessity, some way has to be determined in order to get everyone back on the table and have Latin America as a region. You must understand that we are 660 million people now. And by 2050, Latin America will have 800 million people. So in terms of demographics, it is very important. We have natural resources that are important to the rest of the world. The Amazon region is key to having a safe environment around the world. So Latin America matters. It's just that it has become irrelevant. And I think we must make things happen.
Good. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now from Ukraine and talk about a little bit of democracy, right? As you all know, corruption has been linked to many countries in Latin America. Hey, there's corruption history here in Chicago, right? Now the question is, let's be honest. I mean, everybody knows. So my question is, how has corruption in Latin America impacted the democratic process? Going back with President Zedillo.
Well, Alex, I think the two topics are very important by themselves, and it has certainly some connections. However, I think it's very important to start with a very strong statement, in the sense that what we see today in Latin America, and I hope this is temporary, we are seeing a very concerning democratic regression. It took many years to build real democracies in many of our countries. Some countries in Latin America live under dictatorships. Other countries live under systems that, although formally were called democracies, they were not really effective normal democracies. And it took many years to transform that panorama. And we thought that with a few shameful exceptions like Cuba or Venezuela, Latin America could be called without hesitation a region of democratic countries. I think what we have seen in the last few years is very unfortunate, because that construction that took a lot of effort and several generations is now being frontally attacked by people who got to power by virtue of the democratic reforms that were made before their time, and now that they have the power, thanks to democracy, are working assiduously, systematically, abusively, autocratically to destroy our democracies. So I think we have to start with that concern. And of course, this also means that a byproduct of this attitude and this way of govern goes with another very concerning aspect, which is the undermining of the rule of law. Whatever rule of law we have, and one Latin American disease profound and all Latin American disease is weak rule of law. Well, whatever weak rule of law we have is now being also attacked by these autocrats, by these populist leaders. You cannot preserve democracy if you don't have reasonable degree of rule of law. They notice that, so they are going against democracy and they are going against rule of law in many ways. First and foremost, by dismissing the validity of the rule of law, because they claim to incarnate the will of the people. And since they incarnate the will of the people, they feel themselves authorized to say, oh, okay, that's the law, but it's not important. What is important is what I say, because I have interpreted the sentiment of the nation. And this is terrible, because if you don't believe really in democracy, despite being a beneficiary of democracy, right? And if you don't believe in the rule of law, well, we know the story. And the story is a very Latin American one. It ends up in tragedy. So, of course, a byproduct of that is that if there was ever a serious attempt to build a stronger rule of law and with that to fight corruption, I will say that for the most part, we are going through a process of stagnation in that endeavor. So this is not a good moment.
President Cedillo, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up. I would have liked everyone to have a word on this very last question. But if we can have a minute, if we can have a minute to take to answer this question, we can.
Well, just say that the levels of corruption in Latin America is obscene. We had, I will say, the only case which touched almost every country, the private and public sector at the same time, and that was the lavajato. And also all that has to do with the contracting services to build infrastructure in Latin America. First. Secondly, the weakest pillar of democracy in Latin America is the rule of law, as President Cedillo mentioned. If we will continue having impunity, we won't be able to face the problems. And finally, the responses that we are looking for preventing even more deterioration of democracy is bringing even more pressure on democracy, because one response is hyper-presidentialism, which has to do with the new populist leaders, and the second is more fragmentation. So we need to look for some more innovative ways to approach to the problem of democracy.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to the public from our audience. I want to thank you for answering these questions. I know it was just 3 questions, but we took all the 40 minutes. So we're going to go with, I don't know if we have our first question from the audience.
Okay.
Wow.
Hi.
Wow.
Un volado.
¿Sacaron ficha?
Un voladito.
My name is Alejandro Roemer. I'm from Mexico. I'm a second-year MPP student at the Higher School of Public Policy. And thank you all. This has been very insightful. My quick question is especially to President Cedillo regarding the question of democratic consolidation in Mexico and as well as in other countries of the region. Every electoral cycle we have the assassination of at least dozens of political candidates at the municipal and state level. My short question is, what is the influence of organized crime in shaping democracy in our country as well as in other countries in the region, and especially at the local level? Thank you.
Well, I think it's evident that Mexico is suffering what Colombia suffered, 20 years ago or so, where the organized crime decided that they wanted to have instruments from government to carry on their own business. I don't have any inside information, of course, of what's going on in Mexico, but evidently these assassinations are acts of intimidation and I would say almost of terrorism, not only against candidates, but also against journalists. And that, of course, is part of this process of erosion of the rule of law and of erosion of democracy. Now, having said that, I think there's another side to this question, and that is Latin America has followed the paradigm of dealing with the drug problems that was established internationally but emerging strongly from the United States many years ago. That is to say, to deal with the drug problem as a criminal problem, instead of looking at it as a public health problem, as a human rights problem, and so on and so forth. And we bought that approach, which has proven to be absolutely wrong. And I think the situation is not going to get better unless the governments and the societies of Latin America say enough is enough. We are going to stop providing the money, the authority that we have provided to organized crime by following a rather stupid way to deal with the drug problem. Now, again, it's very sad that nowhere in Latin America, I'm talking about the major countries in terms of their economy and population, are really reconsidering profoundly the drug war strategy. So that, again, means that we will see more of this, and hopefully it doesn't get to a situation that whatever governance we have is lost because of the influence of organized crime.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is José Luis Betancourt. I am an MPP student. I'm from Venezuela. My question is for all of you, principally for President Chinchilla, who has been through Latin America helping democracy. And government, mainly democracy, is a very human enterprise. What do you think about the problems that we have right now, or if it's the problem right now, on human capital for our political institutions, like bringing the best people to politics and create the incentive for them to work together as a way to sustain democracy in the long term. And I don't want to miss the opportunity, President Lagos and President Fernández, who were at the summit of Mar del Plata in 2005. If you can talk a little bit about that, about ALCA, what was your policy dilemma at that summit, what you think about that 20 years later, and if you think a initiative like that could be achievable in the near future.
Okay. Human capital is the most important asset for any society. Let me give you the example of my country, and excuse me because I love to talk about my country. I feel very proud about it. We were the poorest colony at that time in Latin America. However, we decided to invest in education. We were the first country to declare free education for everybody, for every children. That was many, many years ago. Our first president was a teacher, not a general. And so we decided to invest in education. And we were able to succeed, to insert in global economy, to become very fast from a agricultural-based economy to a technological-based economy. And everything at the same time when we decided to ban the extractive kind of industries, which are the industries that usually bring money to the Latin American nations. We do not exploit oil, we do not exploit gas, we do not exploit copper or gold. Everything that we are doing has to do with human talent. So we have to invest in that. But education is not only about having more competitive economies. It is also about having more democratic societies. And the only positive thing that the only positive news that we are receiving from the different reports about the deterioration of democracy in the world is that education works in favor of democracy. Those who have access to education tends to be more kind of democratic, democratic kind of people. So once again, I think that if we want to aspire to a different kind of development and more stable democracies, we need to understand that the human talent is the most important asset, and we have to invest in education.
To the second part of your question, what about trade? I would like to answer with President Mandela. He says that, globalization is here to stay. Now we are going to be living in a global world. Therefore, we are going to be needing some rules of the game at the World Trade level. And the World Trade level is organized through the World Trade Organization. And the big issue then is to prepare for that. There is no question. Globalization arrived. What are going to be the rules of that globalization? The rules are going to be paid at the World Trade Organization. And here is where we are, because the World Trade Organization is not in very good shape. President Trump decided to forget about that. And therefore here we have another problem inherited from Trump. And the question is now that there is no question. Free trade or no trade? And what do you mean by free, quote unquote? What about the rules of the game? And let's be very clear. In this century, the future is in the Asia-Pacific countries. In the same way that after the Second World War, it was the North Atlantic, the major ocean where the rules of the game are going to be played, and where played there. Now, it's in the Asia-Pacific. All of us have to prepare for that. And what are going to be the rules of the global world? And unless we prepare for that, then the globalized rules are going to be established by the major countries. And when you are in a small country, you need to have some rules. And that is why it's so important now to enforce again the World Trade Organization. And let's prepare for that. Otherwise, globalization will remain. Winter will be coming, as Mandela used to say. And if we know that winter is coming, better we prepare for that. And that is the global world that we are going to be living in. And Latin America has to prepare for that. There's no question on that. And then the other major element related with the previous, that there are so many global problems that require global solutions. With regard to the question of corruption, what about the question of global trade with narco-traffic? Until what extent narco-traffic is also a global problem that has to be addressed. And that will be addressed because we produce the drugs in Latin America, but the major markets are in Europe and in the United States. Therefore, it's very clear that some kind of understanding has to be established. We, the producing countries, and there where the consumption is. What are going to be the rules of the game? And what about legalization of some drugs? Because in the way that we are understanding how we're going to defeat the question of drugs, up to now we have not been very successful. And this is another area of the multilateral elements that has to be taken at the global stage. Otherwise, we are going to be failed in each of our own countries. And that's essential.
We have many more questions. We have probably about 4 minutes to go, so.
Hi, my name is Connor Lee. I'm a second-year student at UChicago. So climate change is impacting areas worldwide. Countries like Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic are hit especially hard by frequent hurricanes that devastate crops and infrastructure. Also, rising sea levels have added to coastal erosion as well as loss of tourism, which many Latin American countries rely on. So my question is there a collective effort among the Latin American countries to combat climate change and its effects?
Great question.
The answer is no.
Simple.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to read the newspaper to realize that there is no coordination in any significant way. There are some countries that are trying to comply with the international accords that have been created, the Paris Agreement, but some countries in Latin America have decided that although they will not withdraw formally from those agreements, simply will not abide by the commitments that they took. And unfortunately, again, that is the case of some of the largest countries in Latin America that are moving exactly in the opposite direction of what is the scientific consensus and the economic consensus on what must be done to fight climate change. So my answer is no, there isn't.
Okay, Alex, perhaps I can refer to, yes, referring to this last question, I would say that we have national agendas. There is a national agenda in the Dominican Republic to tackle climate change, of course. What we don't have is a coordinated regional mechanism to do that. So we abide basically by the 2030 UN agenda that has a chapter on climate change. And so we deal this issue from a national perspective, not a regional perspective. On the other hand, the question about what took place, the 2006 Summit of the Americas back in Mar del Plata, very briefly, what I would say is that a long-term debate surfaced at that summit. And the question is, why is Latin America poor? And as you know, the answer has been that historically, poverty in Latin America was determined because we were countries that depended too much on agriculture and agricultural exports. So there was a need for industrialization. How can we move forward with industrializing our countries? And the economic model that was adopted for industrialization was a nationalist, protectionist model. So we substitute imports with local production, local manufacturing. And this was the way for more than 30, 40 years, right? So in substitution to that model, coming into the 90s, we had the Washington Consensus, or what is called in Latin America political jargon, neoliberalism. Right? And so the question was at that summit, if globalization was going to have a human face, or globalization was neoliberal globalization. So this was the debate. And the question is, globalization within the Washington Consensus perspective tries to fix some of the flaws in the previous economic model and try to stabilize microeconomic indicators. So you can have economic growth, you can have fiscal balance, you can have employment, you can have all this, but there is something that was lacking there, social issues. There was no reference to education, to healthcare, to social security. And so this was the debate that took place on that occasion at the summit.
Just one point with regard to the question of climate change. You are going to be living in a different world with a different paradigm. We used to be, as I said before, the paradigm was how much are you increase per capita income. In the new paradigm, the next question will be, oh, how interesting is your per capita income? But can you tell me, what is your per capita emissions? And the human per capita emissions is going to be the real yardstick of the new paradigm. And therefore, all of us are going to be living under that new paradigm. And because that paradigm is going to change all the rules of the game that we have been knowing up to now. In other words, the international generational gap is going to be over. Because what kind of world are we going to be living to our future kids? And therefore, what is going to be the new paradigm with regard to per capita emissions? And that is going to produce a different world. And you have to adapt for that new paradigm. That would be my answer with regard to
Thank you very
climate
much.
change.
Unfortunately, our time is up, so I just want to thank you for joining us today. Again, welcoming you to Chicago. Thank you for taking the time, for traveling, and thank you. Thank you, the audience also, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. It's been interesting.
Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
It's always ambitious to try and contain the thoughts of 4 presidents in one
Not easy.
90-minute panel, but it's also a tremendous honor to have your collective insights into these issues. We used to talk about democracy in Latin America with a kind of anthropological distance, and now we realize that the struggle for democracy is global, and we have not escaped it, and we're all united in it, and it's a continuing thrust of our concerns here at the Institute of Politics. I want to thank our partners, Juan Pablo and U Chicago Global, for not just helping us execute this event, but conceiving of it wouldn't have happened without you, and we're really grateful. These types of events are a great reminder of the tremendous assets the University of Chicago has to offer. And I will only say our mission at the Institute of Politics is to inspire thought and empower action, and you've all helped us in that project today. So again, we're grateful for your insights. Alex, again, thanks for your moderation, and thanks again to all of you for participating in this discussion. And please join me again in one last round of applause for our guests.
Start up here, right?
Yeah, you should. Good evening, everybody. My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to a discussion about cities, climate change, and communities of color. Before one of our students formally introduces our guests in a few minutes, I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have at the IOP and also go over some housekeeping. This Friday, IOP and U Chicago Global are co-sponsoring a midday event at the Rubenstein Forum that will focus on democracy and economic development in Latin America. And we have 4 former presidents from Chile, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico who will be on that panel. That starts at noon, I believe. On Wednesday, April 27th, former Baltimore Health Commissioner and CNN medical analyst, Dr. Lena Wen, will be joined by WBEZ's Kristen Schorsch for a midday event at Ida Noise. And also on Wednesday, April 27th, I'll be moderating, no, I won't, but David will, be moderating an evening discussion about the legacy of former Chicago Mayor Harold Washington that will feature Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, Cook County Circuit Court Judge Tim Evans, and Don Rose, who served as one of Mayor Washington's political advisors. And for those of you who don't know, David Axelrod was also one of Harold Washington's political advisors. We'll do audience questions tonight, so after the moderated discussion, we'll open the floor to take questions from all of you, so please line up to ask your questions at the microphone. Masks are optional when asking questions per the university's latest guidelines, and as usual, we give priority to the first questions to students. And please make sure your cell phones are on silent, and with that, we'll now hear formal introductions of our speakers from Gertie Zwick-Schachter, a first year in the college who is planning on majoring in fundamentals and human rights. Please join me in welcoming Gertie to the podium.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Gertie Zwick-Schachter. I'm a first year in the college planning on majoring in fundamentals and human rights. And I am lucky enough to be in the position of student ambassador to Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms through the IOP Pritzker Fellows Program. I'm excited to introduce this conversation about how mayors grapple with the effects of climate change in their communities. This discussion will address the particular threat that climate change poses to communities of color and those living in large cities, and the effectiveness of prior attempts to mitigate this threat, as well as potential future policies. We will be hearing the perspective of former Atlanta Mayor and City Councilwoman, as well as current IOP Pritzker Fellow, Keisha Lance Bottoms. Mayor Lance Bottoms was a visionary leader in bringing equitable outcomes to the forefront of government and commerce in the position of mayor, and was the first mayor in Atlanta's history to have served in all 3 branches of government. We will also be joined by the former mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, and former IOP Pritzker Fellow and EPIC Policy Fellow, Heather McTeer Toney. Mayor Toney also served in the positions of Vice President of Community Engagement, as well as Climate Justice Liaison at the Environmental Defense Fund and Senior Advisor to Mom's Clean Air Force. This discussion will be moderated by the Director of the University of Chicago Program on the Global Environment, Dr. Sabina Sheikh. Today's event is co-sponsored by the University of Chicago Program on the Global Environment and the Energy Policy Institute. Thank you all so much again for being with us today. Without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Sheikh to get us started.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And let me just start by saying it's a great pleasure and honor to be here on the stage with these 2 amazing women. And I can't wait to hear about what they've done in their cities and how they see our future with climate change. And so I thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for having us here. I guess I wanted to start just by way of introduction, maybe with a bit of an icebreaker, which is how we start class sometimes, and I know the students don't like it, but let's try it up here and see how it goes. First, just a question that I have is, like, how do you become mayor of your hometown? It's an amazing accomplishment, and I'm curious what led you to that place. Was it a childhood dream or ambition, or a less direct path? And once that happened, what was most important to you that first day when you became mayor and you walked in, you were inaugurated? What was the most important thing to you? Let me start with Heather.
Well, thank you. First, thanks so much for having us. I'm excited. Wonderful to be sitting here with you. I think this is probably one of the most amazing seminars. How do you become mayor? You ask people to vote for you. That's what you have to do. I cannot say that it was a childhood dream. It was the fact that things needed to be done. And more often than not, when you see women in leadership, particularly women of color in leadership, it's because we know how to get things done. And people trust us with getting things done. And that was the situation in my hometown of Greenville, Mississippi. We had not had an African-American mayor or a woman to serve as mayor. And I was elected back in 2004. It was a time when the city was suffering from extreme financial strains, and my first day in office, I found out we had no money. So again, it was about, all right, let's jump in here and let's figure out how to get things done, but also recognizing that communities want to live and thrive, and it becomes our responsibility to be an asset in that. So it is being a public servant every single day.
Great, thank you.
I had never thought of running for mayor, quite frankly. Never thought of running for office. I was a magistrate judge. I ended up running for a seat on the Superior Court, and I lost. Best failure I ever had. Had an opportunity to visit communities across the county and wanted more for my city, my community. And so that's what led me to ultimately run for city council and then mayor. And the great fortune of being in the city, they say if you can't see it, you can't be it. I saw people who looked like me in leadership, so it was not far-fetched that I could do it. I just had never thought about doing it.
That's great. I think you both raised something really important, that in the sense that as women in leadership roles, or as when we don't, it's not necessarily the case that you're aspiring to become this elected official, right? But you see things that need to get done and you find the way to do it, right? And so I think that's a really important point that I try to think about a lot. So on topic for tonight, let me start with something that's probably a huge question, but quite foundational. I think when we think about the environmental justice movement, and in the early days of the movement, there was this perception that it was about the location of polluting sites, for example, in poorer neighborhoods and communities of color, and that's still very much the case. I mean, just look at Chicago and what we've sort of been dealing with here for the past few years, and it's an ongoing problem. But I think what we've realized over time is that environmental justice is this confluence of deeply rooted economic, environmental, and social conditions that have led to people of color, people in lower economic groups, just being exposed, uneven exposures to pollution and disparate health effects, greater vulnerabilities to climate change. So I'm wondering if you could, maybe each of you talk about these root causes of environmental justice, specifically how historic policies and land development practices have sort of led to these environmental injustices or these outcomes that we see today.
Yeah, I think when we think about environmental justice as a terminology, it is a construct in the United States that comes out of systemic racist policy that unfortunately we have been, that has really been pushed throughout a lot of federal regulations. You look back at the federal housing guidelines back in the 50s, 40s and 50s, even going back to the early 30s, there were very specific metrics that were in place that created redlining. So you can look at a form from the Federal Housing Administration in the 40s, and it has a line to check for Negro. And that check box is directly correlated to redlining throughout the United States of America in over 100 cities, Chicago being included. Well, when you talk about the practices of permitting and what was put into communities and how we got to a place where you have siting of environmental hazards and pollutions which create toxic air, toxic water, the inability to breathe clean air, it comes again and is born out of these policies that put people into these communities. It's not like Black and brown and indigenous people chose to live next to toxic sites. It had to do with how they were put there. But I think even going back a bit further, environmental justice has been a part of social justice since the very beginning. I mean, the 1982 Warren County, North Carolina, that's where a lot of people point to in terms of the beginning of the environmental justice movement. But that actually came out of Atlanta because it was through the SCLC where you had students that were trained that knew what to do in that space. So it was born out of the civil rights movement. When Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee as a part of the sanitation workers' strike, to have Black people not be considered the same as trash. I mean, you really think about how it started and what environmental justice is. It stems back to the desire to be treated equally like everybody else and having access to the same clean air, clean water, and clean land as everybody else.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think to put it very simply, when you are talking to communities that may not understand the buzzwords, when you talk about 3 people on the block have died of cancer, or 7 people on this street have been diagnosed with cancer, and the kids have asthma and all these health issues that have root causes, it gives you a better understanding of what this movement is about and really what it should be about. And I know that just this week I saw the story about a cancer cluster that was traced back to a high school. I believe 100 people from this high school, including several in one family, diagnosed with these very rare cancers. And my understanding from this story is that this high school was built on the site where soil was brought from another site, and they suspect that may be the source of contamination. And that's what's happened in a lot of underserved communities. They were built on cheap land, even in Atlanta, just outside the AU Center, and the community that my mother grew up in. This neighborhood, Vine City English Avenue, traditionally poor African-American neighborhood, it's recently been discovered that the soil is contaminated. And my grandfather was diagnosed very late with ALS, which is very rare and sometimes linked to pollutants and toxins, et cetera. So I immediately began to think, well, about the people in my family who have been diagnosed with cancer, and how far back was his soil contaminated, and how has it impacted the health outcomes of my family in particular. And so this is why it's such an important conversation. We may not understand the buzzwords, but we understand how it impacts our lives.
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I think that we're really, I mean, we know a lot about environment-health relationships with respect to asthma, with respect to cancer, but I think we're just scratching the surface of other ones. And so we see research all the time that environmental exposures are connected to Alzheimer's, to diabetes, to other things that we may not be even considering the environmental dimensions of that in policy or in planning. So I think that's a really important point. It seems like the recognition is growing that climate change and equity are inextricably linked. And I know there was an event with the IOP on Monday on climate change in Illinois, and particularly the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And so I'm curious, how effective do you think these type of state policies, or in some cases city policies, I know Chicago's working on one as well, that link climate change and equity, do the strategies to you, do they seem deep enough to counter these historic reasons for inequity? Or are we talking about, we need massive structural change, we need, a Green New Deal for cities and more? I'm just curious if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it is, so do we need massive structural change? Yes, we do. How do we go about doing it is the part that we're all having this conversation about. I think we can agree sort of as mayors, you can't silo an issue. Like a mayor cannot sit in a seat and say, I'm only going to work on this one particular issue. Because in executive leadership for a city, you're responsible for all aspects of executive leadership in that city. And so to look at the policies on a local level, it's really important that we talk about climate policy in conjunction with the other issues that are happening in the city, like job creation, economic development, health, education, criminal justice reform. Like, it's so important to tie them together, because for leadership on a local level, that's what they have to do every single day. You wake up in the morning and you don't know if you're gonna have a situation where there is a building falling down because of something that happened, or you've got protesters in front of your house, or you have to deal with some major health emergency, or a multi-billion-dollar business is trying to locate in your community. All of these things, they may not sound like they're connected to climate and environmental policy, but in reality, they are. And so connecting the dots in a way that is effective for people who live there, but also to address the climate and environmental issues that that particular community is facing, I think is the big structural challenge that we have to talk about. I know it's Earth Week, so everybody's excited. Yeah. Earth Day is on Friday, and everybody's talking about climate and policy. But what do you do next week? What did you do last week? Where are the policy conversations that are taking place in December? Right? It has to be an ongoing, integrated part of our conversation.
Yeah, and I have my phone under my notes because I have some stats on here, so I don't want you all to think I'm texting while I'm up here if I look on here. But as I was preparing to come today, I was looking at some really interesting stats. Again, just going back to Atlanta, the percentage of the average income that goes towards energy bills and housing and transportation. And as Heather has said, all of these things are interrelated. So when you have 48% of income going towards energy costs, housing, transportation, that's a significant amount of money. That's life-altering for many people. But we also know that when we are creating policy, it's not just for today and easing these burdens, these financial burdens quite often. It's about planning for the future. And when you are an elected official, people want things delivered immediately. It is very difficult to get most people to think about the year 2035 with our clean energy plan, for example, in the city, or even 2050 when you're talking about what will happen in 2050 when people are looking at their streets and their streets are torn up today and their trash needs to be picked up right now. It's very difficult, but we know that's what policy is all about. It is about the future, and as responsible leaders, we don't have the luxury of just thinking about today, because the policies and the challenges that we are facing today is because many leaders in the past didn't think about the issues we'd be facing in 2022.
I love that. It's like we were at, you think about the protests. What do you want? Climate action. When do you want it? In 2050. That's not what you're going to hear. That's just not, that's not the term. It is about what's happening and how do you connect it to that energy bill, that mother who's got 2 kids with asthma. She's, working a full-time job. She's a frontline worker and she has a high energy bill. How does this relate to changing her life? What are the economic opportunities for her and her children? And at the same time is looking to reduce the air pollution from that concrete batch plant that's at the end of her block. That's using this opportunity around renewable energy to ensure that the church she goes to has charging stations and has an electrification hub. Like, how do we incorporate all these things? Is what we call the cumulative impacts. And I think this is what you were getting to before when we were talking about maybe issues of asthma, diabetes, heart disease, things we haven't calculated. Well, all of these are cumulative impacts that are more prevalent in communities of color. So in Atlanta, Chicago, in Oakland, California, you will find more issues that are environmental and climate related, especially in the Southeast, because there are more communities of color that live in the Southeast. But all of these cumulative impacts together is what makes it harder.
Yeah, and I think that, the point about it sounds very daunting. As a mayor, you have to deal with these day-to-day things. I mean, there's been mayors in Chicago lost because they didn't get the streets plowed in time, right? And I think that dealing with all of that while you're trying to think about sort of climate change is not something that's happening 20 years from now, 50 years from now. It's happening right now, right? And I think that's something that trying to think about that, but also plan for the future. You have to balance budgets, and I think so. I mean, I guess the question I have about that then is what can mayors do? Like, what's within the purview or the jurisdiction, the governance structure of a city in terms of dealing with climate change versus what's needed from a state, from a federal government? Can you comment on that?
Well, for me, the most important thing was to make it make sense for all of our communities. Because otherwise I couldn't sell it. Because if I'm talking with someone who doesn't know how they're going to get food on the table tomorrow, they're not really thinking toward 2050.
Right.
Because it's not impacting their day-to-day. So part of it was a communications issue. If I go into my mother's Bridge Club meeting on Saturday, what am I going to say to her about climate change? She may not want to talk about climate change, but I guarantee you they're going to talk about how high their power bill is for the month. So that was, first of all, important. And then to talk about what it means for all communities and why all communities should care and have buy-in. So we were very fortunate in that we had groups like Bloomberg Philanthropies who helped us create our climate policy, and we were able to get a grant from Bloomberg. And that's an important piece because, again, often cities have limited budgets, resources, staff, et cetera. But when you can have other groups, whether it be, well, I won't say the state of Georgia, I don't think that's a really good example, but if it's the federal government or if it's an outside agency saying, let me help you craft this policy, then that's very helpful. And then secondly, if you have a city, again, like Atlanta, for example, that's an inland city, people may not think that climate change impacts them because we're not necessarily getting hit by hurricanes and we've had a lot of flooding as of late. But when you put it in the context of Hurricane Katrina, for example, and how you had people move into the city, thousands of people move in, that really changed the landscape of the city in many ways, that then makes sense to people. So it may not be happening in our backyard, but if it's happening nearby and it impacts your city, then that means the policies of that city and that state really should reflect what's best for us as a whole.
I absolutely agree. Mayors and local governments are responsive. They are responsive to the citizens that they serve immediately. You're going to call your mayor or your city government when there's a fire, when you need police, when you need emergency response to a hurricane or a flood. You are not calling the governor's office, you are not calling state police, and you certainly are not calling your member of Congress first. You make that 911 call that goes locally. And so helping communities to be responsive is tantamount to being right there with them on the front line. And we have the same, that even in environmental groups and environmental communities, we want to move at the speed of light. We see the science and the data, and we know it has to change. Communities move at the speed of trust. And there's a lot of trust building that has to take place in order for us to leverage and work together. But let me give you an example of something that I am excited about, I see working really well. There's a group, it's a business, it's called Charger Help. They're out of California, started by 2 Black women who found a problem. And the problem was that with all of this new EV technology coming online and everybody putting it up, it was great, it was going up, but it was not being maintained, which means you would have an EV charging station that was put somewhere, but if it ever went down, it would be 12, 24 hours, 2 to 3 days before somebody was able to fix it. And so their whole business model is just to fix the charging stations. Now, I love this because I'm from the South. I am from Mississippi. Everybody's uncle or cousin has somebody who is an electrician. And this is a workforce development model that you can train people to be and do what they do on new technology. But here's the kicker when it comes to local government. Mayors have the authority to say, you know what, we have to have, if we're going to put in infrastructure with the bipartisan infrastructure funding, if we're going to outlay this, we want to make sure that it goes into Black and brown communities. We also want to make sure that those are not the communities where it stays down. Because more often than not, your minority communities, if you get some infrastructure in, they're going to be the last spot that it gets put in and the last spot that gets repaired. And so as part of like the contracting, what they began to do was to work with communities of color to say that if you're going to have EV charging stations, those stations must be maintained. Just adding that simple language is something that can be done on a local level. It creates job development, grid stability, renewable energy. It provides a tremendous amount of opportunities, and that can be done on a local level. So thinking in the ways that are responsive to the community, but also creating opportunities for communities is tremendously important. And then here's the last thing. If you did not know this, know it now. Out of all of the cities in the United States of America, the top 5 are all led by people of color. The top 3, or 3 of the top 5, Chicago, New York, and Houston, are led by African American mayors. So these are centers of population where you have minority leadership that, again, are thinking about how to address problems in a way that meets what that community needs.
That's great. There are about 10 things there that I want to follow up on from both of you. So why don't I pick up where you just left off with infrastructure? And I think, so the infrastructure funding, infrastructure bill is a way that states and cities get funding from the federal government, one of the ways. And I thought one thing I found frustrating, very frustrating during the debates about the infrastructure bill is there was this, maybe it was a smaller group, but this idea that infrastructure has to be defined very traditionally as this physical gray infrastructure, right? But we know green infrastructure, social infrastructure, cyber infrastructure, we know how important these things are. How do we convince people that those are critical pieces of infrastructure that need the funding at the federal level to come to the states, to come to the cities, as opposed to, not opposed to, but in addition to funding for roads, for bridges and things like that?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, a lot of times people have to learn the hard way. And the best example I can give, in Atlanta, 3 months into my term, we had the biggest cyber security attack of any city in the history of America. And it took us completely down. Thankfully, our infrastructure, our public safety infrastructure, water infrastructure, et cetera, was not compromised. But I had just come out of a almost 2-year mayor's race with forums, debates. Not one time did anyone ever ask me about cybersecurity. It was about things that people could see. But again, putting it into the context that it makes sense to people. When you think about our infrastructure, you think about the quality of our water, how we protect our water supplies. It's important that we have funding to do that. But if you go to your tap and you turn it on every day and it comes out and it looks fine and it tastes fine, people aren't necessarily eager to put their limited tax dollars towards maintaining infrastructure that they can't see. But it is extremely important. And again, going back to policies, creating policies that you can say, this is our goal, this is the funding that we need to support this goal, and this is why it is also important to your community.
I mean, absolutely. Cybersecurity is just one example of a way that a major infrastructure door is open to attack community residents. And we so often forget that we're a part of a larger global community that experiences a lot of challenges. Right now, there is a war in Ukraine. And even in the midst of a war in Ukraine, we have to think about the security of American cities, and that goes to mayors. So let's say if, Mayor Bottoms would have ignored that, that could have been an open door for a foreign enemy to attack water systems, to attack the electric grid, to in some way inundate United States citizens in a way that is not only harmful to us, but also detracts and takes away from how we're able to address the energy crisis and climate change. So even cybersecurity, yes, is a climate issue. It is an environmental issue. Now